Chapter 4: The Church of Yevon. During the first calm, the citizens of Spira began work on rebuilding what had been lost, mainly Bevel. However, it wasn't too long before Sin reappeared and immediately began destroying the rest of the Machina cities around Spira. Noticing this pattern, Machina use in Spira began falling out of favor. After years of living under Sin's terror and with the scattered knowledge of the events that transpired during the Machina War being slowly twisted through the telephone game effect, Bevel started forming a new religion which came to believe that Sin was a punishment to the people of Spira for letting their use of Machina get out of hand, and that if they atoned for their sins, Sin would eventually stop coming back. Use of Machina would become akin to sacrilege, and a tradition of summoners going through a long pilgrimage to eventually receive the final Aeon would be adopted. The people who ventured with summoners on their pilgrimage would become known as Guardians, making Zeon the first Guardian. This religion would simply be known as the Order of Yevon. The Order of Yevon would hunt down and almost completely decimate the Betel population because of their use, affinity, and creation of Machina, believing them to be responsible for Sin's appearance. Those who were left alive had to flee and were ostracized by the rest of Spira. Over time, their name would be mistranslated and combined with their creator's name, and they would eventually be known as Al-Bed. They eventually settled in the Cenubia desert of Bikinel Island, but even this they wouldn't have for long, as Sin would eventually destroy it. The first temple of Yevon was in Bevel. When the first summoner party ventured onto the ruins of Zanarkand, looking for the final Aeon to defeat Sin, as they believed that only this Aeon could defeat Sin, they found the unsent Yunalesca. It was from these guardians and summoners that Yunalesca even learned of the Temple of Yevon and their teachings. Even though she knew that their religion was uninformed at best, the teachings of this religion aligned with Yunalesca's ideals. Because of this, Yunalesca simply played along, and from this moment forward, it would become a tradition in the Order of Yevon that after traveling to each Temple of Yevon and Spira and gaining the Aeon from that temple, a summoner would then travel to the ruins of Zanarkand to receive the final Aeon from Yunalesca. Although it is speculated that part of the reason for this is that Yunalesca made a deal with the people of Bevel that if they honored the name of her father, Yevon, she would gift the summoners the final Aeon. It's possible that this is the moment the religion even started being called the Order of Yevon. The people of Spira would come to believe that there was no other way to stop Sin other than this constant cycle of death and rebirth, and that Sin would only stop returning if they atoned for their sins. So, if Sin came back, it just means they didn't atone hard enough. There's only one problem. With Yevon having possessed the final Aeon, the fate statue of Yunalesca's final Aeon, that being Zeon, lacked a faith. Zeon was no longer in that statue, meaning that there was no final Aeon. But Yunalesca found a way around this. What she did was to add a caveat to the ritual. Now, part of the ritual to obtain the final Aeon would be for the summoners to pick one of their guardians, one which they share a very strong bond with, and sacrifice them to turn them into a faith which would grant the summoner a final Aeon. A fact which summoners were conveniently not told until they reached Yunalesca, and thus Spira's cycle of death would begin. Sin destroys cities and kill countless people in its path. Guardians give their life to become the final Aeon. Sin dies. Yevon possesses the final Aeon, killing its summoner. Sin is reborn. Rinse, repeat. Chapter 5: Centuries of History. 200 years later, the Order of Yevon was the official religion of Spira, and it had Yevon as a central teacher type of figure who passed on his teachings on how to atone for their sins. A lot can happen in 200 years. By this point, the Order of Yevon was a full organization with a small group of leaders at its front called Maesters. The only position higher than Maester is Grand Maester. Around this time, a man simply known as Lord Meehan created a group of volunteer warriors called the Crimson Blades. The Crimson Blades dedicated their lives to defending the people of Spira from sin, and their numbers grew quickly. Because of their speedy growth, the Maesters of Yevon began to fear them and quickly accused them of rebellion, branding Meehan a traitor. Lord Meehan traveled to Bevel to face his charges, and once there, he was able to convince the clergy of the good that his Crimson Blades were doing, and that they were not a traitors or rebellious group. So, instead of disbanding them, the Maesters decided to allow the Crimson Blades to continue their activities, but under their control. They renamed the Crimson Blades into the Crusaders, and officially brought them in as part of the clergy under one of the Maesters. The road which Meehan traveled on to face his charges in Bevel would come to be known as Meehan High Road. At some point, Lord Meehan founded the Monster Arena in a place that would later be called the Calm Lands. This arena was a place for crusaders and others to train their abilities against captured fiends. 100 years later, a monk of Yevon called Omega began to doubt Yevon's teachings along with other people as they grew concerned about the fact that sin has not been defeated again since Yunalesca. That was 300 years ago. Because of this, he rebelled against Yevon, an act which cost him dearly. Omega was quickly apprehended, taken to a remote island, and executed. Unable to move on to the far plane because of the hatred and anger he held and because nobody sent him, he eventually became a fearsome fiend called Omega. Omega was fueled by so much hate for Yevon that as a fiend, he actually created another fiend called Ultima Weapon. 200 years later, the Meehan High Road would be destroyed by sin and a new road would be built. The old destroyed part of the road would be known simply as Old Meehan High Road, and the new one would just be Meehan High Road. 100 years later, after many attempts at defeating sin for the past 600 years, finally, a summoner known as Gandalf rose up. In his travels, believing that summoners owe more to the people of Spira than just defeating sin, Gandalf managed to help the people of a continent known as Jose by herding an infestation of fiends known as Cactuars into a plain with constant thunder. There, he locked them up in stone, making sure they didn't bother the people of the Jose again. Because of this feat, the people would come to call these plains the Gandalf Thunder Plains. But later, it came to just be known as the Thunder Plains. His travels ended when he finally received the final Aeon from Yunalesca, faced off against Sin, and finally, he managed to defeat Sin, ending its 600-year rampage. His fight against Sin tore a deep ravine known as the Scar across the lands of the plains that we're fighting on. Gandalf, his final Aeon, and Sin fought at the bottom of this ravine. Their fight would continue to ravage the plains above, isolating a temple known as the Ramium Temple. This fight would begin a sort of tradition for summoners to face off against Sin in these plains, as there was a vast isolated land, meaning there was plenty of room Sin could be fought without the risk of destroying cities. Because of this, these plains would now be called the Calm Lands, after the calm that happens upon defeating Sin. With that being said, after Gandalf's defeat of Sin, the second calm began, and just like with Yunalesca, Sin possessed Gandalf's final Aeon, and the shock of their mental link being severed kills Gandalf. In his honor, the people of Spira began referring to Gandalf as High Summoner, and from now on, any summoner who defeats Sin would get the title of High Summoner, technically making Yunalesca the first High Summoner. Likewise, a guardian of a summoner who defeats Sin would be known as a legendary guardian. This defeat of Sin would give credence to Yevon's teachings, restoring the faith of many. His journey and sacrifice would then become a model for all future summoners. A few years later, Sin re-emerged in its third incarnation with Gandalf's final Aeon at its center. It's that people just didn't repent hard enough. Now having a clear model of what to do, The next High Summoner would come sooner. Instead of 600 years, it only took 140 years for the next High Summoner to come along. This was Lord O'Halland. Lord O'Halland was a blitzball player from the island of Killiga. Oh, by the way, blitzball is still a popular pastime in Spira. In fact, it is the most popular pastime. One of its only pastimes. Lord O'Halland used a bladed blitzball as a weapon called the World Champion. And with it and his final Aeon, he defeated Sin a third time, bringing about the third calm and eventually the fourth incarnation of Sin with O'Halland's final Aeon at its center. Just like with the other High Summoners, O'Halland died due to the link of his final Aeon being broken. Are you noticing a pattern? 130 years later, the fourth High Summoner would emerge, Lady Yokun, a former Crusader. The same pattern happened. Yevon possessed her final Aeon, this killed her, the fourth calm began, and she would be named High Summoner, and Sin V5 would eventually emerge with her final Aeon at its core. Chapter 6, Seymour Guado. We are now 100 years before the events of the first game, but we still have a few short stories to tell. Let's start with another character montage, similar to the one I did in my 4th Xenosaga story video. These characters were born between 100 years to 10 years before the first game. Here we go. Yo Micah, Trommel, Braska, Sid, Oren, Rin, Awaka the 23rd, Seymour Guado, Isaru, Kimari Ronso, Lucille, Barthelo, Donna, Waka, Lulu, Maroda, Wants, Letty, Kipa, Nuj, Klasko, Elma, Jasu, Shalinda Baralai, Bada, Brother, Dado, Yuna, Titus, Gata, Payne, Gipple, Riku, Kali, Pase. Okay, now let's rewind a little and focus on some specific events during the century I just rushed through. 50 years before the events of the first game, the aforementioned Yo Micah became the Grand Maester of Yevon, meaning he was the spiritual leader of Spira. 5 years later, a man named Braska was born, and 10 years after that, a man named Oren was born. Around this time, another man named Jet was born in Dream Xanarkand. Yeah, time goes on like usual in Dream Xanarkand. People are born and die. 7 years after that, a man named Seymour Guado was born, a half-human, half-Guado hybrid. This would probably be a good time to mention that there are multiple races in Spira, so let's put a bookmark on this. In the world of Spira, there are human, Guado, Ronso, Hypelo, Peru, and the Albed. But the only ones you need to worry about are human, Guado, Ronso, and Albed. Humans are, well, humans. Guado are almost like the elves of Final Fantasy in the sense that they are in tune with nature. They look like humans but with long limbs and fingers and branch-like hair. Their home, Guado Salam, houses the entrance to the Far Plane, making them the guardians of the Far Plane. Ronso are a feline-like humanoid race that are very physically strong and value honor and loyalty above all. If this was WoW, they would essentially be the orcs. Then there's the Albed, but we already know about them. The only difference with them is that their pupils are shaped like spirals and they're all blonde, I believe, and have green eyes. Okay, now let's continue with Seymour. Being a half-breed, Seymour was viewed as an abomination by both human and Guado, which is ironic considering that his father and mother married for the sole purpose of uniting the two races. Although the marriage wasn't looked down upon that much, the birth of Seymour was. Despite the scorn from both races, Seymour and his mother stayed in Guado Salam with his father Jiskel, who, 3 years later, would become the leader of the Guado and would spread the faith of Yevon to his people, the Guado. However, 8 years later, civil discord began to brew within the Guado tribe, and in order to prevent disunity, Jiskel was forced to exile his wife and son Seymour. In the dead of night, Jiskel's retainer, Trommel, had his wife escort Seymour and his mother out of Guado Salam to an island city called Bodge for the good of the Guado and for their own safety. 2 years later, when Seymour was only 10, he and his mother made their way to the Xanarkand ruins to defeat Sin. His mother knew that she would soon die for some unexplained reason, and she feared the idea of her son being left alone when she died, so her plan was to become a powerful faith Aeon for him, so that he could defeat sin and gain the love of the people of Spira. This was a plan that Jiskel was aware of and silently supported. However, when his mother became the Aeon Anima, Seymour became horrified. I mean, look at her. I really don't blame him. She could have definitely picked a prettier look. And he broke his pilgrimage to return to Bodge. Here, he would spend the rest of his childhood.